Tier lists. I'm going to talk today not specifically just about this one, but just about them in general and why you really shouldn't take their advice or look at them at face value, because I understand that if you're a new player, tier lists can usually be helpful, especially ones like this that list single target, burst, and AoE. Depending on the number of targets, it can tell you how valuable and how good a character is in most of those contexts. However, I think that a lot of individuals look at a tier list and say, oh, hypothetically, Silverwolf or Sealy or Luocha or Dan Heng are S tier or S plus tier in this instance, and therefore they are must pulls. And I don't think that's true. I think that tier lists work well for introducing an individual to a game and trying to get them to understand which characters are going to be worth building if they have them. And if they have them is the key factor here. But the problem then lies in if they don't have them and they're upcoming. Hypothetically speaking, let's say you haven't summoned for Dan Heng and you're wondering and you look at a tier list and you see, oh, he's S plus tier, he's on par with Sealy. And maybe you have all the other units, but you have Sealy and you know how good she is. It's a question of, is this character now a must pull because they're on par with this unit, and do they require as much or as little investment as this one does? And I think that's a bit of a problem when it comes to them. Tier lists can indicate how maximum potential or max invested a unit can perform, and if they're on par with somebody else, but they don't necessarily tell you the pros, the cons, the downsides that may come with them, how difficult or how constrained their teams are, etc. I also think we all need to kind of just admit tier lists usually aren't the best indicators of performance. I will always use Jing Yuan as an example because this man has single-handedly every single release of a new character that does any degree of damage, doesn't matter how much, been pushed down. He was, I believe, up here where Blade and Kafka are. He was pushed down to A tier. I believe he was lower than that when the initial rendition had SS+, I believe. But, hey, that's an entirely different story. Tier lists as a whole are incredibly difficult to gauge a character's value on, because even if you're separating from single target to multi-target, like in this instance, it doesn't tell you how much value you're getting out of pulling that character. Hypothetically, a character like Kafka can be great in AoE scenarios, but is this Kafka by herself? Is this Kafka in an AoE scenario? Is this Kafka with a team based around agility and damage over time? I don't know. Sure, you can click on the character and go in depth, but still, it doesn't necessarily tell you the entire picture or show you the big picture of what this character can do and what are the downsides of them. And it's much more, I think, misleading to a degree when a lot of times characters are usually at least judged and based around their performance in something like Simulated Universe or Memory of Chaos. Memory of Chaos, at least in this rotation, refers something like damage over time, which is great for Kafka, so it boosts her up here. Whereas the moment these buffs may leave, you may see a character like Kafka drop down. Because the roster is so limited in terms of supports, if you're boosting one character up to their max potential, if you're hypothetically going for Sealy and you have her best team, then theoretically she may perform really, really well. But if you're taking up all the units who would normally be used by your other characters, it's very difficult to invest into these other units to get them to perform on par or the same as other characters or what they're listed as. If you're taking a Sealy and you're sliding her next to a Bronya, a Ting Yun, and your Luocha, all of these units are taken away from the other characters. So hypothetically, let's say they can get Dan Heng, and you're going down to his teams, where your Bronya is already out the picture, and so is your Luocha. So your team is theoretically lowered in terms of the maximum amount of damage. If we're basing them solely around the max potential they can reach, then your value and the amount of damage you're getting out of this character are inherently limited by the amount of these units that you have available and what your other teams are. Because if we're truly trying to look at these units, the characters that have the most value in terms of what you get for your money is going to be somebody like Blade and Sealy or Dan Heng. This is because Blade as an individual doesn't need a Ting Yun, and so he frees up your Ting Yun for another team. In the same vein, Sealy can get the most value out of a Ting Yun buff because those 3 turns don't necessarily count for her resurgent procs, which means she, technically speaking, if she kills every one of those turns, gets 6 turns or 6 actions. And so the same applies to Bronya, and the same applies to basically every other unit. I don't want you to look at tier lists and say, oh yeah, they're awful, but I do want you to understand tier lists don't show you a full picture of a character's performance and how they're going to do long term. You can see a character, we can actually look at the support and defensive options over here. If we're legitimately trying to analyze these characters, Japard and Bailu drop down immediately on Luocha's release, which theoretically may be true because they're not as good as him. We don't have many other options in terms of a healer or preservation unit. So if that's the point of comparison, and that's the A tier and best character, it's kind of iffy to say, yeah, they're not as good when he's the only other option you have. So I don't think the roster is large enough to warrant a tier list that has this many tiers, S plus, S, A, and B. Because for the vast majority of people, S plus and S are basically the same thing. Because many of you, if you're free to play, or maybe if you're a light spender, don't have the resources to not only invest in these characters in the first place, but even get them. If I'm looking at and trying to list out and recommend what you can build, I understand that the maximum value you may want to get on somebody like Tingyun is increasing her attack. Same thing with Pela, same thing with Asta, because Harmony characters get hit all the time, especially if they're foxes. So Yukong and Tingyun are up first. But if I'm looking at these units, if I'm trying to tell you what to invest into, I also need to understand your resources are incredibly limited. And telling you to pull for this character because they're S+, and the next patch, Fu Xuan, is S+, so you gotta pull for her now. And she's listed as really high because of what she provides you. Then next patch after that, suddenly she drops down because preservation units and damage mitigation isn't preferred. You're in a bad spot because you've pulled for units who you don't use and can't use because they occupy the same slot, and each one is, technically speaking, better than the last in terms of a DPS ranking. It's very difficult to adequately gauge the performance of a character you're getting, especially if you're listening to individuals who are basing or focusing on the value or meta perspective, how much damage they can do, what they have the potential to reach in terms of your account. Because even if you have their best supports, doesn't mean you have multiple copies of their best supports that somehow slide into the exact same team on both sides. And so I don't want people to look at tier lists and say this is the be all end all, because tier lists usually aren't. Characters have set values. Characters are really good. Silverwolf is great. Sealy is great. I just got Branya. She's wonderful. Same thing with Japard. I have a lot of characters built up and invested into. I will not be getting Dan Heng just because I don't like his character. I don't like his 4-star. I don't like his 5-star. Whatever. Entirely different perspective. But I don't even like Kafka. But I also know that regardless of your account, you don't have two Branyas you can simultaneously run on both sides of a Memory Chaos team. I also know you don't have two Silverwolves you can run. And so when units require multiple supports that are shared between the same teams or the same main damage list, it's incredibly difficult for me to adequately say this character's S tier to pull for them, because they're taking away valuable units from your other teammates. Instead, units who can help you facilitate a different amount of team variations or help you in some way, shape, or form free up a support from that team are great. It's why Blade can hypothetically, in a lot of scenarios, be better than another AoE character because they free up your Ting Yun, because they may free up your Branya or somebody else who maybe doesn't or will and is still to a degree useful, but not as useful as they would be for somebody else. I think that if you're analyzing tier lists, you're going to find that pretty much every patch, the newest character is S tier, is the best, or is very close to the best. And if every character is almost S tier or almost S plus tier, what is the difference and what really makes him shine? If Kafka's S plus tier or S tier, what is the difference between her and Blade and legitimately every other character you have access to? If Branya's S plus tier, and I have her, I can understand what separates her. Well, she, for one, doesn't have the same competition that DPS characters have. Your DPS is Sealy. Your competition for Sealy is your Dan Heng, your Blade, your Kafka, your Jing Yuan, your Yan Qing, your Clara. You have basically, I'd say like at least 1 to 2/3 of the entire roster are competing with Sealy. And so if a character is told, or at least touted as S tier or S plus tier, or almost perfect or amazing or the best DPS, that's a pretty high bar set. But at the same time, they also have to require the exact same supports. We don't have that many 4-star healers. We have one. Getting another one later on this patch. We don't have a bunch of buffers that a lot of people have built up. And if we're truly being honest, the resource management in this game is so god-awful that investing in one character takes about a month to actually get up and running, because you're spending the same amount of resources you would on a light cone, on their traces, on their ascensions, and now you have to level them up, and it's awful. So I don't think it's ever fair to say this character's S plus tier or this character's a must pull or the best in the game when the next character after them may be slightly better, and suddenly that last evaluation you made maybe wasn't the right call. And I think Jing Yuan is a great character. I just think we should also use him as an example of how a tier list and how initial perspectives of a unit can be misleading, especially long term. And especially if you don't have the expendable resources, gems, or money to pull from multiple characters, patch after patch after patch, it shouldn't be immediately touted that this character is wonderful, that this character is amazing. And I think we've toned it down to a degree, but as we just saw with Dan Heng, it's maybe not to the degree that it should be. Because there is no multi-day period or week-long period where nobody talks about how great a character is until they fully tested them, until they got a great feel for the character and their issues. Because as of right now, on the day of release, Dan Heng was S+ tier with Sealy. Sealy has at least held her position long term. Dan Heng was released a day ago, and even if he is good, we don't know how his long-term performance is, especially not enough to the extent to where we can rank him with other characters. But that's just my opinion. Tell me yours down below. I understand you can differ from me. If you have him, go ahead and talk about him. Either way, if you enjoyed it, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.